Ghana's government has invited pension funds holding around 31 billion Ghana cedis, about $2.8 billion of domestic debt, to swap their holdings for new bonds. This comes as Fitch Ratings has also affirmed Ghana's long-term foreign currency and long-term local currency issuer default ratings at restricted default, while also lauding the West African country for progress made with official creditors at its external debt restructuring program. Joining me now from Accra is Paul Frimpong, development economist and executive director of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Paul, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So starting right off the top, this offering that the Ghana government is making to the pension funds, let's just get straight into it. What do they hope to achieve with this swapping of the holdings of about 31 billion Ghana cedis of domestic debt for these new bonds? What are they looking at?
Well, I think it's in the same light, when the government last year introduced what we call the DDEP, which is a domestic debt exchange program. And this became very imminent because at the point, and still now, the government lacked the ability to actually meet its obligation towards these bondholders. So, when individual bondholders or institutional bondholders, when you hold government bonds, there are maturity that comes with it, which the government has to pay upon maturity. So at a point when the government feels, based on prevailing conditions, they are in no position to be able to meet their obligations, then they have to come up with solutions. And one of them being the domestic debt exchange or debt exchange program, which we did the domestic one. So government says that, okay, I know I owe you. I know what I owe you has matured. The time is near for me to pay you back. But unfortunately, I'm in no position to meet that obligation. So here is a line of program that we can all work around to save whatever the money that you have with me, even before we talk about the interest rate I'm supposed to pay you. So that is the conversation that happened last year. And in the same way, at that point, as of December last year, the government stated that they are not touching the pension, bondholders, because it marks a special group. So these are special interest group, because when you look at pensions, you all know the implications of pensions, pension funds, because these are monies or investment that people are holding towards their retirement, and some are already retired, some are retiring very soon. So obviously, when people plan their pension, schemes, it's towards their retirement. So if I'm holding a pension investment that is going to mature, let's say in 2023, it means that probably I'm going to pension this year, and that is supposed to be my fall on resources for the rest of the years that I'm going to spend. So when you are bringing up a restructuring on exchange in that kind of way, then it means that you're going to postpone when these individuals or institutional bondholders, pension bondholders, are going to have access to the resources to give to the individual bondholders that they hold their money in trust for them. So it was a big deal. I mean, even before government came out with the domestic exchange program, they brought some exemptions, and one of the key exemptions was the pension bondholders, that this group, for now, we are not touching them. Pension bondholders, we believe that we might have the clear or the leeway to be able to pay bondholders in terms of the pension side. So we will not be touching them until when we just got the update that now they want to propose that they fall into the debt exchange program, right?
Yeah.
So it means that government is still not out of the woods. Government is still in a fix in terms of its ability to meet that obligation on the maturity of the pension fund. And therefore, now government is saying that we have to go back to the table with this special group. And we're going to see what is going to unfold in the next couple of weeks.
And it's interesting you call them a special group, because last year when the government did say that it wanted to primarily include the pension funds, there was a lot of ruckus in Ghana from the pension funds. And eventually the conversation was that governments would exempt them from the domestic debt exchange program. And that was also after there was threats of industrial action. So now that this swap looks like a reversal of that, and you're saying we're back to the drawing board, in terms of the initial reactions we're getting from the pension funds, what are the reactions right now? They were threatening industrial action previously last year when this idea came up, and now it's back on the table again. It's almost like government has no option. So what is the reaction we're seeing?
But so far, it hasn't been. We haven't received any position. I mean, different from what the pension funds earlier on alerted the government about when the domestic debt exchange program was launched. So we are yet to see if, based on the new proposal being put before them by the government now, because now this is very specific, right? So the other one that was done that the pension funds were exempted was more like very general. So mostly, if you're holding any form of government security, right, if you're able to come in and do the exchange program. But this is especially created very here for pension funds, right? So if you look at even just a few trying to get my head around it, you can realize that even the rate, the interest rate on the has even been up by a certain percentage. So instead of the 18.2% that they are supposed, by the time the exchange is moved about 21%. So it's in a way, why government is going to get the breathing space by being able to restructure these pension funds and, of course, spread it, beyond the current maturity rate of these pension bond holders. You can see that one way or the other, it's a bit kind of different from the one that was done, the domestic debt exchange program that was done and completed a couple of months ago, because that there was a haircut, and the haircut means that people lost on their especially when it comes to the interest rate that they're supposed to earn on their bonds. So with this case, I'm sure with this kind of new proposal that seeks to not present any major haircuts on bond holders, pension bond holders, possibly it could get a different reaction, which will not, of course, be outrightly positive. But I'm sure when they engage and if they're able to negotiate even more in terms of what they believe will be ideal for them, I think that will change. That could change the narrative or the position of the pension bond holders. But we are yet to see what that will be. Obviously, with this, I'm sure it's going to be a huge number of engagement that's going to happen between the custodians of these bondholders, pension bondholders, and the government.
And it's interesting because there's a 2-week deadline on this, which puts a bit of pressure on the pension funds themselves and also their customers or their holders to quickly make a decision in regards to this. But let's come to where all of this is going, because Ghana is also looking to extend the maturity of bonds that the pension funds hold in exchange for higher interest rates. Now, we know that there's the IMF conversation going on, which is ongoing, developing as it will be, in terms of how this offering to pension funds will impact or possibly help Ghana secure near-term debt relief under the support program. Do you think it has a potentially positive impact or no impact at all? How does this offering to pension funds play into the larger debt relief conversation with the International Monetary Fund?
I think Ghana governments clearly, when look at even the mid-year budget review that was presented by the finance minister, clearly we are still not out of the woods here. We are still finding ourselves in economic, downturn in so many aspects, because we've even revised almost all major macroeconomic target that we set for ourselves for the year 2023. Even in the background that we are having, or we are under the IMF program, even as at now. So it shows that this breathing space, of course, when we did the domestic debt exchange program, about 85% of bondholders actually subscribe, and it was voluntary. But of course, we know that even though it's voluntary, but there's a bit of a catch there. As you mentioned, you're just giving 2 weeks ultimatum for pension bondholders to subscribe to this new program that we put out there. That means that it's more like not giving even them the chance to evaluate, the options that are available to them. So obviously, that could be a bit of desperate from the government side to get this done. But again, it speaks to the volume that the government still need more space, more breathing space in terms of their obligations towards those that hold their security. And if you look at even the implication of the debt exchange program, I mean, it has, a very, denting, negative, activities even on fiscal structures of some financial institutions. Most all the banks, as of December, when we look at the books of the banks that came out, almost all the banks in Ghana run at a loss, and largely because of the domestic debt exchange program that took place within last year. So there's that kind of complication when it comes to whilst government getting the breathing space. I mean, if you don't take care, it could lead to even higher consequences. I mean, if you look at debt exchange program that happened elsewhere in the rest of the world, talk about the Greece, even the Caribbean, Jamaica also did the same, and almost always found themselves in a very difficult fix in terms of financial institution inability to even get access to funds and be able to even leave it out for businesses who need some of these funds for their own expansion and growth. Even in Ghana, we are still battling with the issue about inflation. So much so that even the central bank was increase our policy rate, which is they are using contractionary policy rates. And globally, that is even the trend, across central banks. So everyone is cutting down, contracting to be able to curb inflation. And we still have issues around the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which affects food prices. And the food basket in most emerging countries, including especially Ghana, is a major contributing factor to the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So, yes, so we have a and even as much as this debt exchange program is going to give the breathing space to the government, I'm hoping that we're able to capitalize on this to make some prudent, measures. I mean, even now that we have the IMF, to ensure that we're able to offset some of the challenge that some of these corporate institutions are going to go through.
Okay, so in terms of this, let's move to Fitch now, because I said earlier this is also happening. This hand extension to pension funds is coming also now, with Fitch also downgrading Ghana's long-term foreign currency and long-term local currency issuer default ratings to restricted default from C, and that's due to this missed Eurobond coupon payments, which was held off since February of this year. What were the things that Fitch was considering, and what do you think the implications of this further downgrade, unfortunately, is right now for Ghana?
I think that for them, the scenarios, the situation that we find ourselves being in since about 2-3 years ago hasn't changed that much. And that's what I said earlier. We are not out of the wood yet. We've not been able to get a grasp of what the situation that we are dealing with so much. Even though, I mean, the whole point was that if you go under the IMF program, it brings some level of credibility. It hasn't really matched up yet in terms of that expectations, in terms of the credibility that we were expecting from the international community. And so when we look at that from that point, even it became very contentious as to whether Ghana is going to get a deal or not. In fact, we were expecting to get our deal done as of last year until this year that we got a deal done. So obviously it was a very challenging moment. And all of those situations, we look around and also look at even the global uncertainties, right? And looking at our own projections and the downgrades that we're making on projections. Obviously, if you are a Fitch rating, you could see that when you put in your metrics and your methods, you could see that nothing major has changed in terms of how the country wants to rebuild or rebound back, even under the IMF program. So for me, I don't think major things have changed. And therefore, for them, once they look at some of these scenarios, inflation at this rate, missing out, not growing at a rate that can actually lift us out of this situation, they will be left no choice than to put us at that level, even especially when you started missing out on your Eurobond obligations. So I think those are some of the conditions they look at, that we haven't been able to capitalize on even the IMF program. It hasn't really led us to gain credibility in terms of the international capital market. Domestically, you're battling with inflation, your currency situation, businesses are struggling, businesses are posting losses. So these are major issues that we've not been able to deal with. And therefore, I mean, obviously, and I'm sure other rating agencies will also come out, with their ratings soon, and might not be as much pretty and could be similar to what we are seeing from the Fitch ratings.
And there's a lot to take there. You can see it on your screen now, if we can get that back, in terms of some of the things that Fitch is saying right now about Ghana, affirming the long-term foreign currencies, I said earlier, also downgrading Ghana. That followed, of course, the expiration of the grace period. And we saw the downgrade of Ghana's LTLCIDR in April of 2020, following missed payments on some local currency denominated bonds. There's also, of course, the CCC issue rating of LC bonds. Fitch also expecting public sector debt to reach 99% of GDP at the end of 2023 from 88% at the end of 2022. And that, of course, has to do with the depreciation of the cedi against the dollar and financing assurances also that have been provided by official creditor committee. We'll come to that in just a moment. But Paul, let's look at this. Fitch is expecting public sector debt to reach 99%. What exactly is left? And do you think that this particular prediction is on the mark? Is it really on the money coming from Fitch?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, debt exchange, debt to GDP ratio is a very key metric for especially developing emerging market. It's so, so for example, you can have a situation where a European country would have about 80% of their debt to GDP ratio and will not be a major concern than, even when, like compared to a country like Ghana. Because when your debt, taking on debt, okay, the conversation about debt is not so much even so about how much debt you're taking, but the ability you have based on your current structure, based on your current economic setting, based on the health of the economy. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel that can prove that I'm taking on this debt, but I am showing that I have the capacity and have the means to meet my debt obligations, right? So when they say that for developing countries, for emerging markets, we are saying that the maximum that your debt to GDP should be around 60%. Anything above that is unsustainable, right? And that puts you even backwards, because then as long as your debt to GDP is growing, your credit worthiness actually also dwindles. You're becoming more very risky, right? So even if you're going to get access to a long-term credit facility from outside, from the international market, it's going to be at a very high rate because your risk profile is increasing by the day. So for developing emerging market country like Ghana, the ideal, maximum rate that we're looking at should be 60%. Anything above that is unsustainable. And we're looking at almost now, we're dealing about 88%. And that is your projection that it could go as high as 90%. That means that we virtually be left with nothing. And that makes the country a very risky country. So it's a very, dire situation that we find ourselves in, that we're taking on so much that we can actually have the means to pay back. And that is a huge concern. And so, again, even much so about when we talk about debt to GDP, like I said, the how much you're borrowing will not be an issue when you have the means. You've shown that you have the capacity to actually pay back. But more so, also it's about the content of the money that you are borrowing, what it's being used for. That's also another debate, right? Yes. So you cannot be borrowing and be spending, right, on recurrent expenses that will not, in the medium to long term, yield any returns for the country, right? So if you're borrowing to, and we all understand, borrowing for recurrent expenses, borrowing for capital expenditure, and the implications of both sides. Of course, government needs to run, needs to be operational, so we understand that money has to be spent on the recurrent. Of course, that also boils into your size of the government, right? Living within your means and not beyond your means. And guess what? For Ghana for some time now, obviously the conversation, and we all know when the report from the Auditor General comes out, it shows that government has almost always been living beyond our means. So we are taking so much beyond what we have the capacity to actually pay back, or even spend judiciously the money that we are taking. So I think those are some of the challenges that we're looking at. And if we're doing about 88% as of now, and now you are downgrading some of your major targets that could actually contribute to your growth potential, that can also reduce your debt burden, then it means that it's not far from that we could be hitting over 90% by end of the year in terms of our debt to GDP.
And the fortunate thing is that there are many African countries that can see themselves mirrored in some of the situations that Ghana is currently facing. The numbers may not exactly be the same, but a lot of the underlying issues are also the same. But Paul, we barely have 2 minutes to wrap up this conversation. And one thing that Fitch did mention, of course, was this official creditor committee. So that'll be my final question to you. Just give me an answer in about a minute. We're asking ourselves at this point, because it seems that Ghana has failed to make really adequate or strong progress when it comes to restructuring of that $20 billion external debt, and even in assurances from its official creditors, whoever they may be. So in terms of Ghana's workings with the official creditor committee, in terms of reaching an agreement before the end of this year, where do we stand currently right now? We have entered August. We are just a few more months into before 2023 wraps up. There's the IMF conversation, but with the official creditor committee, which holds a very large part of the answer or solutions to what Ghana is facing, where do we stand? Just about a minute as we wrap up.
I think there's been progress in that. I mean, that actually is one of the reasons why it led to even the IMF releasing the first tranche of the $3 billion bailout that government got from them. There has to be more conversations. I think some of the creditor committees, for example, even at the G20 level, the Paris Club, they've all shown some level of commitment, because this is a global phenomenon. Even though Ghana needs it more because we are among some of the countries around the world that are under the IMF program. But I think there has been progress and government showing a bit more domestically in terms of what you're trying to do, in terms of trying to show their commitment to be fiscally disciplined, in terms of trying to show their commitment to be very prudent, in terms of showing their commitment to cut down waste in the system.
Okay.
I think some of these domestic measures could be a very bargaining point for the government when they are making their case with these creditor committees. And I believe that with some of these signs that we've seen, we might be able to get in some of these commitments being made possibly in favor of government.
Right. And it's a conversation we're following and one we've been discussing with you over the time as well. Paul Yaw Frimpong, development economist and executive director of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Thank you so much for joining me. I know we'll be speaking to you again soon.
Definitely. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And it's a conversation we'll be having with Fitch predicting that debts will eats up about 99% of Ghana's GDP, 2 weeks being given for pension funds to decide what they want to do, as government is now asking them to come into this debt swap arrangement. Will the funds take them up on this offer when just a few months ago last year, they were threatening industrial action if they were included in the domestic debt exchange program of the government? We'll see what develops in the next coming weeks. Now you have international headlines coming up, and after that, a conversation about Africa's crypto and alternative financing space. Stick around. This is Business Edge.